Okay, I think we are good to go. I can see the participants streaming in now. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone who's here. Hello, Ricardo. Okay, great. We're getting a lot more joiners now. My name is Fiona Wilson for everybody who's joining. I'm from the Clinton Foundation, and we have 3 other panelists with us today. But we're going to wait a couple minutes before we really start the presentations, because I know it can often take folks 2 or 3 minutes to have Zoom load. So we're just going to be hanging tight for a few minutes here. Great, and just while we're waiting, we'd love to get a sense of where all of the attendees are from. If you aren't familiar with Zoom, we do have a poll function, and our first poll of the day is we'd love to know, where do you call home? So I'm actually in South Africa. Our panelists are from other countries altogether, and I know we have some attendees from the Africa region, but a lot of interested Caribbean participants. So, okay, it looks like we've got, great, Seychelles, another Seychelles, Scotland, San Andreas, amazing. Okay, great. We've got quite a diverse audience today. Okay, oh, we've got Norway as well, Italy, Seattle. Some people are up really early today, so thank you for joining. Okay, Fort William, Scotland, great. Okay, I think we're gonna go ahead and start. Basically how today's panel is gonna go is we'll give a bit of an introduction about this project, the Seychelles Marine Floating Solar Project. And we've got some great representatives from the project team who are here who can share about different angles of the project, different challenges, and the way we've addressed those challenges. So you'll hear from all of the panelists. We'll have a panel discussion, but there's a Q&A function in Zoom for those of you who are not familiar with the platform. And so at any time during the panel, not only can you chat with the other participants, but you can load a question in the Q&A function so that all of our panelists can take a crack at answering it, and hopefully we can answer all your questions. Great, we've got some more islands represented, St. Lucia as well. Great, welcome everyone. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started if you'll let us load the presentation. Great, okay, if everyone can see that, I think we're on track. Yeah, so welcome everyone. As you know, this panel is called Making Marine Floating Solar a Reality, the Seychelles case study. We might have wanted to put marine in the name of the title originally. So for those of you who are excited about floating solar, I have even better news for you. We're talking about marine floating solar in a seawater context. And that's part of what makes this project really exciting. And so all of these panelists who you see on the side, we have folks from Norway, Seychelles, and Ivory Coast, a really diverse team that's come together to make an innovative project happen. And so what we're hoping for today is to share some of the lessons that have come from developing this project, so that other islands or other countries in the world can benefit from the experience. So a little bit about this project, if you haven't heard about it already. It's a 4 megawatt project, approximately, and it's led by the Government of Seychelles. So that's the Seychelles Energy Commission, and other ministries have been involved, but also the Public Utilities Corporation, which is the state-owned utility in Seychelles. And what's exciting about it is it's located in a saltwater lagoon, Lagoon le Rocher in Providence, which is sort of an industrial area on the main island of Mahé in Seychelles. So for those of you who have not had the pleasure of visiting Seychelles, it's an island nation in the Indian Ocean. It actually has over 100 islands in its archipelago, but there's 3 main islands in Seychelles where most of the residents are concentrated. Mahé is the biggest of those, and that's where the project is going to be located and delivering power. And the project is structured as an independent power producer. So not only will it be Seychelles' first IPP, but it's also on track to be Africa's first utility scale marine floating PV plant. So many of you might have seen coverage of utility scale, really large power plants that are floating PV technology. But to date, FPV has really been deployed in a freshwater context. So lakes, reservoirs, that's where all the big plants are right now. But deploying it in a marine location is going to be really key for island countries especially, but other countries where there's land scarcity or just very, very expensive land, competing uses for land. And so I'm saying here on the slide, it's on track for other firsts. So depending on exactly when the construction and commissioning dates are, we're competing with some other projects to be firsts in different categories. So stay tuned. This is a aerial shot of the site. So you can see in sort of this southeast corner here is roughly where the array will be located. And the reason I'm showing an aerial view of the site here is because I think it's key to understanding the innovative nature of the project, and that it is a seawater marine environment, but also that it's somewhat de-risked because of the sheltered nature of the lagoon. So we can come back to look at this later as well. And so you heard me mention, we're competing to be first in a number of respects. You might be wondering what's happening with the project now, when will it be completed? So the pre-qualification phase for the tender was completed, oh, I'm sorry, that's a mistake. It was concluded the end of 2018, a year ago. And then the full RFP launched to those pre-qualified bidders in May of this year. So actually just last month, all of the bids were submitted, technical and financial proposals, which is a great milestone, and the project is in the evaluation phase right now. So we're on track for awarding the project by the end of the year. And the government entities and other members of the evaluation team are working very hard on that right now. And so when I mentioned the project team throughout the course of today, I'll give you a little bit of information about who that is. So again, it's a government public project, as public as an IPP can be, but government and the Public Utilities Corporation are leading procurement, and specifically the Seychelles Energy Commission, which is also Seychelles energy regulator, has been really key in terms of the vision for the project and de-risking it and implementing it so far. But also, in addition to government and the utility, the project is supported by the Clinton Foundation, where I'm from, as well as the African Legal Support Facility. And then through support from the African Legal Support Facility, we've had really incredible advisors and experts come on board the project team, including from Trinity International for legal support, and Multiconsult as tender and technical advisors. So that leads me to today's panelists, who I would love to introduce. We have Cynthia Alexander from the Seychelles Energy Commission, who's here from Seychelles. We have Gasevic Ndahumba. He's from the African Legal Support Facility, based in Ivory Coast, but as everybody in the islands community knows, often these jobs require a lot of flying around. So Gadi is joining from, I'm not sure what country, he can tell us. and Simon Gasevic from Multiconsult. And myself, Fiona Wilson from the Clinton Foundation. I'm our Senior Regional Manager for the Clinton Climate Initiative and our Islands Energy Program. So I'll tell you a little bit about our role in the project, and then I'll hand it over to the rest of the panelists. So within the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton Climate Initiative is specifically focused on tackling climate change. And in particular, our Islands Energy Program was founded back in 2012, actually, with the aim of supporting island countries and the utilities and islands in transitioning from fossil fuel-based energy systems to renewables. So I'm sure that I don't have to tell most of you here that energy is a really critical issue in islands. Most islands tend to rely heavily on imported diesel for their energy uses. And although they have often really great natural resources that can be deployed as renewable energy sources, our program tries to provide what support we can in accelerating the transition to renewables so that energy is cleaner, indigenous, and also more affordable for islands. So we've been a proud partner of Government of Seychelles since 2013. We've worked on them with Government of Seychelles on a number of projects, including this floating solar project, and we're really excited to see it take shape. But with that, I would love to turn it over to Cynthia from the Seychelles Energy Commission so she can introduce a little bit about herself and the organization and their role in the project. Thanks, Cynthia.
Thank you, Fiona. Warm good evening from Seychelles. My name is Cynthia Alexander. I work as the Principal Officer for Renewable Energy and Energy Management for the past 4 years at the Seychelles Energy Commission. The Commission is mandated to regulate the electricity sector, as well as we implement the energy policy and strategies, including promotion of renewable energy and energy management in the country. My work basically involves implementation and development of renewable energy projects and energy efficiency projects. We are also responsible for education and awareness to promote renewable energy to bring sustainability to different target audiences. As Fiona rightly mentioned, we are the implementing partner of the 4 megawatt floating project, and we have always looked forward to build our capacity by trying new innovative ways, which we will be discussing more. And I thank you for this opportunity, Fiona.
Thank you, Cynthia. And Gadi, can you introduce yourself and the organization?
Yes, thank you, Fiona. So as mentioned, I'm sorry for the background noise. I'm in transit, but I'll do my best to not be too noisy. So I work for the African Legal Support Facility, which is an institution that was developed by the African Development Bank. We are still hosted by this organization. It's an international organization in itself, but we are in close cooperation with the African Development Bank. At the LSF, I'm the head of the power sector, so I mostly work on IPP projects, some other form of projects in the electricity sector as well. The ALSF is actually an institution that was created to support the negotiation of governments with the private sector. So we only work with governments on the government side for the negotiation of projects all across the continent. Just in the power sector portfolio, we have about 35 different projects. It's even more than that. It's 35 countries, so on 54, that's pretty good. And we have a few islands in the portfolio. So we also work, for example, in Seychelles, Mauritius, and Madagascar. So we're quite involved in this region. The great thing about working for the LSF is that right now on this continent there is a lot of opportunities for innovation because of the high cost of electricity, as briefly mentioned by Fiona. There is a lot of countries on this continent that are looking for innovative ways to tackle their electricity needs. So in that vein, SEC contacted us and Clinton Foundation actually in 2016 for these projects, and there were still some important technical questions to explore. So we got some support on board, and we got Trinity and Multiconsult. So the kind of support that the LSF, I should have mentioned that, provide is legal, technical, and financial. So the team that you will need to negotiate an IPP project on the government side will need to obviously have some legal knowledge, but also some technical and financial. So you can assess the full project. So yeah, so we've been working with Clinton Foundation and SEC since 2016, and we are now really happy that the RFP has been closed, and we are in the evaluation process.
Great, thank you, Gadi. And I'll turn it over to Simon from Multiconsult to introduce his organization, and he'll also be able to give everyone an overview of floating PV technology, because I know a lot of folks here may not have that much experience with the technology, even though there's a lot of interest and clearly a great potential for it in the islands. Thanks, Simon.
Great, thanks, Fiona. Good morning, evening, and afternoon to everybody that's joining. As Fiona mentioned, my name is Simon Gasevic. I'm one of the solar consultants here at Multiconsult, specializing to some extent within floating solar, as much as one can these days, considering it's such a new technology. But Multiconsult has been involved since the very early days of floating solar, and has been involved throughout the life cycles thus far. As a company, Multiconsult, well, as its name suggests, has consultants from a wide variety of disciplines, and being from Norway, quite well positioned to be involved in the floating solar market, being that one of the main differences is the floating aspect and the challenges that brings. Norway has quite a lot of experience with the offshore industry, from offshore oil and gas and fish farming, and the anchoring and mooring aspects, which a lot of the new developers and EPCs are sort of struggling to get their heads around and learn how to implement properly. With regards to this project in particular, Multiconsult has been helping out as tender advisors as well as the technical advisors. So we've been supporting all the other stakeholders in preparing the tender documents and launching the whole competitive tender. And also helping with defining the technical specifications, helping with the appraisals and things like that. And personally, I'm more on the technical side as opposed to the procurement side, but everybody works quite closely in this project. I'll now quickly just bring up the presentation. I'll keep this rather brief.
We're also going to launch a poll right now. If you all could indicate what's your level of interest and experience with floating solar, just so we can gauge, what the audience already knows and what you'd like to know. Thank you. And go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, no problem. I might just click on this one. Great. So this is a variation of a presentation I gave only half a year ago, and already going through it to update it for today. It was funny to see how many things are already starting to become obsolete. This market is moving so very quickly. Here we go. Yep. I don't know, that poll screwed with my controls. There we go. So here's just a couple of pictures of existing floating solar plants at a very large scale. From a conceptual design, floating solar is not too dissimilar from the ground-mounted alternative. The topology of the system indeed is exactly the same. You still have the modules. You can, go into a combiner box or straight into a string inverter, or through the combiner box into a central inverter. This inverts the energy. You can go over to a transformer for grid injection. There's not anything new about this. The main difference, obviously, is the substructure. as opposed to having a fixed metal substructure that piles into the ground. This one has floats which float around on the water body, which are held in place by the anchoring system. The floaters provide buoyancy to the system. They need to have enough flexibility to handle the variations in the environment, waves and things like that. They need to provide the same sort of lifetime and warranties that the industry is useful. That being, they're trying to get up to that same 25+ year lifetime, and they just need to show that they have the robustness for wherever they're being placed. The anchoring and mooring system is probably the area where I see the most uncertainty between developers and EPCs. They're not so clear about how to design these systems and have the required level of certainty that they're going to survive the full level. These need to be flexible enough to withstand the wind loads and the wave loads. They also need to be flexible enough for variations in water level. That is, definitely a constraint in this project, which I'll get back to a bit later. The modules need to have more stringent requirements. The main problem is that a bunch of module suppliers that are not so confident and have not so much experience with floating solar are still not sure with how their modules survive in these sorts of environments. And so there's still an ongoing debate about the warranties and how they last, and how the PID is affected by the additional humidity. What kind of encapsulations are best at keeping the water and the salt away from the modules. And so that's still an ongoing discussion. Inverters, we're seeing both string and central inverters. So far with projects, being that most of them have been small, the inverters are typically located on land still. That is to avoid the hassle of putting them out on a float and all the challenges that accompany that. But as projects are getting larger and larger, we're seeing that they need to have inverters out there floating on the water as well. So that's an interesting, some things in the chat. I'll approach those a bit later. Yeah, so there's still no dominant design of the best way to do this, but typically if the project's not so big, you put the inverters on the land just to save on the costs and the challenges that they represent. The main advantages, why do people bother to do this? Well, the first one is that you can use land that is not really being used for anything else. There's a price element. The water is typically cheaper than purchasing land, and there's also aspects of getting the permit and the licenses to build. There are some places with large populations that don't have a whole lot of free space that they can allocate to large farms, and the water is increasingly looking more cost effective just for not having to deal with any of the E&S issues associated with that. In addition, you can often get these things closer to existing infrastructure and save on costs there. A secondary benefit that is more and more being proven by empirical evidence is this additional efficiency caused by the cooling effect of the modules. It depends largely on which substructure is being used, but the body of evidence is now starting to support that you are getting a few percent, up to 10, maybe sometimes more than 10% of a boost in energy generation, just as a result of having cooler panels. And then you can also have some of these tertiary benefits, things like limited evaporation of the water, which is good in large reservoirs and drinking reservoirs. You can also get reduction of algae growth. And once again, for places like drinking reservoirs, that is a favorable outcome. But then in some cases, it can also be a bit of a disruption to the natural ecology. But nevertheless, it's being looked at in most cases as a positive. Market evolution, as I mentioned, this is not such a new technology. It's still relatively young. The first big plants started to come in around 2015. 2016, and then all of a sudden 2017 and 18, it looks like someone did the maths wrong and the numbers just went flying. But in fact, that's sort of when China started to get involved and take it seriously, and they've built a couple of enormous plants. And since then, it has seemed to be following a similar trajectory as to what we have here. I don't have the numbers for 2019 yet, but some of the forecasts that are coming out show that it could have the potential of being up to 23 gigawatts by 2025 by some estimations. And look, that would not surprise me at all. We see a lot of interest in this market, and a lot of people coming to us with questions and with big plans on what they're thinking of installing. And I think once the bankability starts to really hit a critical point, we're going to see a bit of an explosion in this area. Nevertheless, it is still a tiny fraction of all solar that is available in the market today, and probably will remain so for the foreseeable future. As of the end of last year, it was a bit less than 1%. But from an optimist point of view, that leaves a lot of room for future growth. There's a lot of potential if some of these challenges are overcome. And the market's definitely doing its part in sort of promoting the potential of floating solar. If you put a Google alert out for floating solar, you get dozens of hits every week of new projects reaching financial close, starting construction, going online. So it's good to see how much activity there is. The World Bank and CERES released a report late last year on the potential of floating solar, and just on man-made reservoirs alone, and using a small percentage of the reservoirs, they're estimating that there's more than 4 terawatts of potential space available. So there is no shortage of area to do these. It's the challenges lie elsewhere. Where it comes to potential, floating solar is going to be benefiting from a lot of the positive market moves of ground-mounted solar. Modules and inverters are going to continue getting cheaper and more efficient. Land constraints are only going to get more prevalent in the future, and the water bodies are going to start looking more and more attractive. There is plenty of water surfaces, and if we manage to start going marine, like this project is encroaching upon, then well, that leaves us with almost unlimited space. Hydro-connected solar plants are a really fascinating future prospect, which I don't have time to get into now, unfortunately. But there are a lot of synergies that can go along with those. One of the main constraints at the moment is simply a lack of FPV suppliers, not in the number of different technologies there are, because there's quite a few now and more every year, but more in their manufacturing capacity, which I think is still limited to just over 1 gigawatt per year. So even if we wanted to grow, there's that constraint. I won't go into that one. And then for some of the challenges, one of the big ones is logistics. These floaters, as you can imagine, are largely just big pockets of air, and so they're not cheap to transport. 15 to 25 containers per megawatt is more or less the standard for the ones that aren't aiming for more efficient logistics. Soiling is another problem that we're seeing is quite real. The birds really do enjoy these floating islands. They're quite comfortable for them to just sit on there, have their backs against the sun, and then they can just do all sorts of damage. And so figuring out a good way of minimizing this impact is still an ongoing challenge. And then resilience of the systems. Number one, with such a young industry, it's still difficult to prove that anything's going to last 25 years when there's so little evidence of that at the moment. And for offshore, it's even more challenging because once you get out there, you've got things like the waves and the corrosion, which most of the systems are not designed to handle. Most of them are freshwater designed. So that leads to another challenge. But it all comes down to the one major challenge, which is just it's not economic in a lot of circumstances. But on the other side, it is definitely economic in many circumstances, and as the systems continue to get cheaper and land becomes more scarce, it's just going to get more and more cost effective. I did mention that there were a lot of solutions out there. I won't go too much into them at the moment, but as of the last check, this is one of the ones I had to update even from May. There's been a couple of new ones that have popped up with some big systems. Yeah, there's more than 20 systems. There's still no dominant design that's winning. Yeah, searching around, you'll find that there's no end to the innovation yet in this industry, and it's still still growing and consolidating. I'll split them up into 4 general groups in the way they work. But once again, there's no real consensus yet on the cheapest and most efficient way and the best way to do it. So it's an exciting place to be in and just sort of see all the variation. When it comes to frontiers, I usually split FPV up into 2 tiers. There's FPV version 1.0, which is the freshwater systems that we're seeing sort of exploding in the market today. Freshwater, they can usually anchor on land. There's no massive challenges with their installation and running, and they're doing very well. But FPV version 2.0 is sort of where this project sits. Along with solar HPP hybrids, these maritime projects are very much on the cutting edge of floating solar, and they come with a whole lot of challenges that are still being worked out. There's a lot of clever solutions being put forward. One last word on the offshore systems. As I mentioned, most of them are designed for inland lakes or dams. Not many of them have certifications to be in waters with a greater than 1.5 meter wave height. And so that makes it quite difficult once you start going out into open waters. Fortunately, that's not a constraint that we have in this project, being that it's on an inland lagoon. But it is definitely a challenge that a lot of them are looking and trying to solve. And the saltwater corrosion. Some of the different manufacturers have confidence in their solutions and will provide warranties, others will not. But at the end of the day, this is still something everyone's working on. They want to know how their systems are going to react to 25 years of this harsh environment. Yep, as Cynthia said, bringing us back to the Seychelles, our plant is looking to be built here on this lagoon here and a little bit up into this area. I will get into some of the more technical challenges, I think, during the question times. But essentially, this is where it will be built. This is where it will be built. This is where we're planning on floating it. A substation will be put here to transform the power up and inject it into the grid. And yeah, I think that's enough for now. Maybe I'll pass it back to Fiona. We can have some Q&A and then get more into some of the specificities of this.
Maybe if I can add just one more element, which I think is going to be important for the discussion. If you can leave the picture. So one important thing with this lagoon is that it was created because of the land reclamation process in the Seychelles. So that lagoon was not existent. It was man-created. And that will lead into the questions I've seen on the environmental impact for this specific project.
Yeah, thank you for that, Gadi. Definitely an important consideration. And thank you, Simon. That was a great overview. I think it really helps frame the discussion because we're all, I think, beginning to learn how much potential floating PV holds for islands and especially marine PV, but get a little bit of background in the technology is really great. And so my first question, actually, I want to pose to Cynthia from Seychelles Energy Commission. You know, Simon has highlighted a number of, new technology risks and considerations that we have to take into account when we're developing floating projects, and specifically marine seawater floating projects that are in addition to the considerations we look at developing ground-mounted PV. And so can you just tell us a bit more about Seychelles' energy goals and why Seychelles decided to develop this project, why they selected this site as opposed to a site for a ground-mounted PV project, and part of the vision and also constraints behind that decision.
Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, Seychelles is a small island developing states, and as any small island developing states, we rely heavily on fossil fuel for our electricity generation. So our energy policy emphasizes that we need to reduce this dependency on fossil fuel and also strengthen our energy security through development of renewable energy and energy efficient measures. We also have our energy policy setting a target for renewable energy with 5% renewable energy penetration by 2020 and 15% renewable energy penetration by 2030 in our general electricity mix. However, as being a tropical island, we are blessed with lots of sunshine. There is lots of solar potential, even though it is intermittent in nature. So we have been the Energy Commission have been working on promoting solar projects, but on rooftops of buildings because of scarcity of land as well. As the name implies, we are small, and land is always premium, and it is quite important to make sure the land available is used for the right purpose as well. So since 2015, we started to turn our attention to go for floating PV installations. And as you mentioned earlier, you have been working with us from the beginning, and you were there with the Seychelles in supporting us to plan our transition on this low carbon energy sector and move on to see the floating solar PV for Seychelles. It is also important, as you said, there were different factors that affected everything. Like we did lots of researches, we conducted a number of studies, we had meetings to see if that would be a feasible option for us to go. And as Gadi rightly said, we got this lagoon that has been right on time available, where it is closer to our electricity stations. And it was also very important that we got this support to use this lagoon as a load center also. So this 4 megawatt is a utility scale, and this utility scale has to be used because we are having intermittent solar resources. We also found it very important that from the capacity that Seychelles have, it would have been really hard to embark on it. And along with the help of Clinton Foundation, we got into the support from ALSF, and ALSF supported us with their funding to bring in Trinity and Multiconsult, who are now supporting us to have this tender to reach this stage, where we are going to have our first IPP using this project also. And also this site has been chosen because it is already shielded with other lands. It's not open water, so we don't have these tide issues that Simon was mentioning as an important constraint in open marine floating PV systems. So we are looking forward to work on this and see how feasible it becomes. And we are also looking forward to see how efficient we can manage this to become a pioneer in having floating PV systems in a marine environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about the origin of the project concept and why it's such a key innovation for Seychelles, because, you know, in some countries there might be, you know, expanses of open land for ground-mounted PV, but in Seychelles there's really a lot of other competing uses for the land. And I think it's a great example of resourcefulness and innovation, and really Seychelles leading the way for this market development. Does Seychelles have any further vision of potentially replicating this type of project, or is it more fitting into the energy mix of diverse renewables that you're planning to develop?
As I have just explained, our main goal of energy policy is to strengthen our energy security using renewable sources of energy. And also we have to reduce our dependency So in order to reduce our dependency on importing the fossil fuel, definitely we cannot stop here. Even though the energy policy gives a target of 15% by 2030, the Government of Seychelles and the Ministry of Environment, Energy and Climate Change wants to go beyond that, because that is the only way for us to address our climate change issues, mitigation and measures, as well as to work on our nationally determined contributions that Seychelles have. We also currently have a wind power and solar power contributing to some potential, but the focus is more on solar power because of its abundance in Seychelles. This plan is to develop such a solar farm for a small distributed system. What is to be the first stage to go into a big, large developed farms. We are also having other projects that is ongoing, which is to have a 5 megawatt solar farm from the utilities, as well as a 1 megawatt solar farm from the other project from democratization of PV systems under a grant from India. So we also want this project to represent as a first utility scale, as well as first IPP. So when I mean first, it's going to be followed with a second and a third. So so definitely this is not going to be stopped here, but we are going to see the feasibility of having more and more projects in the future, but with the proper legislations, licenses, permissions, and everything in place, rather than having it on a basis of uncertainty.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. It's really inspiring. So actually, I'm going to pose the next question to Gadi from the African Legal Support Forum. I'd love to hear, some more about ALSF's role in this project, but also, we've heard a lot so far from Simon and also Cynthia about the technology. And while this is a technically innovative project, why is strong legal support so crucial for an innovative project like this? And how can actors in the development space, whether they're development banks, international organizations, and NGOs, how can they help progress projects like this that are sort of first mover projects in a technology sense?
Yeah, I would say my answer really depends on which type of countries you're looking at, sorry. In the case of Africa, you have a lot of opportunities because a lot of countries have a high price of electricity. So for innovation, there's a lot of opportunities. So the problems are somewhere else. When you're looking at innovative technologies in developed economies, the biggest problem typically will be the already really low cost of electricity, which makes it hard. So when you get in a developing country like Seychelles, and Seychelles is doing pretty well, but it's still some lack of capacities for negotiation as most countries on this continent. You will want to have a strong team to set up the parameters to bring innovation. So you need some support for the tender process that will actually makes it a competitive procurement process. You need to have somebody that has technical knowledge of what you're trying to achieve. Because in a lot of cases on this continent, you will see innovative projects coming from the private sector, and then the government is a little bit on the fence on whether they would want to try it because they don't necessarily fully understand the technology, which is normal, or don't have the capacity to assess it. So when the LSF came in with SCC, the first thing we did is get Multiconsult on board, and they raised a few red flags about how difficult it would be to have something floating and resisting to the corrosive aspect of the salt water. But after Multiconsult did a first analysis, we got comfortable enough to say, let's try it. There is some potential. It is a small project, but it is worth trying it for the LSF and for Clinton Foundation and for SEC because of the potential impact if we replicate and, at a larger scale. And I don't think it was mentioned, but Seychelles has a lot of lagoon. This is not the only one. So you could easily get similar projects all across the islands. So with respect to developing an institution, I don't think we're that good, to be honest, to push innovation. One of the problem being is that we typically look at really big projects, and the tickets, they call it the ticket size of project is too small when it's pure innovation. So I'm one of the proponent of looking more at smaller projects, because there is more potential if you have a long-term view on some of the energy transition trends. But to be fully honest, most developing institutions will typically have a threshold that is so high that you're not really pushing for innovation. That being said, you have some really good initiatives. For example, there was a big study by the World Bank on floating solar, highlighting some of the potential. So it's not only negative, but I think we could do more, especially if we would look at smaller project with a greater impact, which also means that we need to be speaking more with technically sound advisors. But yeah, in a nutshell.
It makes a lot of sense. I think we all appreciate the frankness there, although definitely we all know ALSF has been a huge support to this project, so maybe this can be an example of supporting small innovative projects that leads the way.
Definitely.
And, yeah. I'm also wondering if you want to share a little bit about the main contracts and contractual risks that a government and utility need to consider for a project like this, as well as from the IPP perspective. But I know ALSF really works on behalf of governments and their state institutions, so that's most key.
Yeah, I've looked at the questions, and the questions are much more technical than legal, so I don't want to get too technical on the legal side. But I would say that it's something to keep in mind when you're working on this continent, is that as opposed to developed economies where the risk, the technology risk will typically be solely on the IPP, it's not the case in most countries. In most countries, most countries on this continent, for IPPs in Africa, even if the project is not well constructed for reasons that are only the fault of the IPP, the government typically will be on the hook for at least the debt linked to the project, so almost 80% of the cost. So there is a real risk when an African government looks into an innovative projects, because ultimately, if they don't understand it, they don't know what kind of risk they're looking at. So this is one of the reasons it's really important for them to have a team that can analyze the project a lot more than it would be in Canada, for example. I worked in Canada for several years. Once the utility signs the PPA, they only commit to pay for the electricity they receive. But if the electricity doesn't get there, they're not on the hook for anything. This is not the case on this continent. Hopefully, the market trend, or the market's going to change and move towards a more equitable transaction. But until then we have to deal with this. And as mentioned, this project is the first IPP. So on top of being a really innovative project, it's also the first IPP in the country. So it's really hard to move the market with a first project, but hopefully I will get better and better terms as we go along and we have more IPP in the country.
Yeah, thank you, Gadi. That's valuable insight. I think we'll see what develops after this project gets off the ground. But with that in mind, I have a few more back to the technology questions for Simon. And again, thanks for that great overview of the FPV market overall. But maybe you can comment on specifically what makes this project unique from a technical perspective, and how have the risks of marine or saltwater PV been mitigated in this particular project as best as we can?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the main things that makes it unique is that this is kind of a bit of a halfway project for floating marine FPV. You know, it's not out there in the middle of an open and rough ocean. So a lot of the technologies that would be hindered by large wave heights, for example, or typhoons, don't really have to worry about that. And it's mostly going to be focusing on things like the impact of corrosion and over the lifetime, and you know, birds and biodiversity and that sort of thing. But yeah, as I mentioned, it's still a marine project. It is still saltwater, so that's probably one of the highest or most difficult challenges. And on the mitigation side of things like that, what we're trying to do is push a lot of this responsibility off the EPC or the IPP and onto the manufacturers as well. We want them to be taking responsibility for their equipment and to be maintaining their warranties throughout the lifetime. Or at least we don't want them to be different from what they would usually offer. And so we want them to have a lot of faith in their products. Another interesting challenge is the water level variation in this lagoon. It can be as high as 2 and a bit meters, but at certain times in the year, it can be completely devoid of water. So the whole plant needs to be able to lie on the bed of the lagoon and be okay. And then when the water comes back in, it needs to be able to once again lift up. And that's a challenge that we haven't seen a lot around the world being tackled. So that's going to be quite tough for them. Access to site is another one. And I think actually there was a question in regards to this, in how you, what kind of security is being considered in protecting the floating solar farm from human actions. In that image I showed, you could see the lagoon, and what we have is 2 requirements for exclusion areas. Around the south and the southwest, we need boats to still be able to have access, because there's a few private properties there and they still need to be able to get in and out with their boats. And then also along the north, there's going to be a bit more land reclamation, and so there needs to be a safe amount of space there, and boats also need to be able to access there if need be. And so one thing I should also mention up front, because I think a lot of these questions assume that a technical solution has been found, is that this project is still going through the tender phase. We've received the bids, but we're still appraising them now, so no final technical solution has been chosen. So we don't know exactly how they're going to do this. From a high level, you know, you can think about things like fences floating or in the ground are possible. You can monitor with cameras and IR detectors. You can have lights on, you can have personnel monitoring. You know, there's a lot of options for minimizing access, but no doubt it is more difficult than with ground mounted plants. So it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see what solutions are proposed and how the IPPs plan to tackle this. And then the anchoring as well. We have this, as I mentioned, the boats need to be able to get around the plant. And so anchors can't be on the ground as with most floating solar plants these days. It's definitely much cheaper and easier to have the anchors located on shore. But in this case, that wasn't an option because we need this access for boats. And so all of the anchors will need to be on the bed of the lagoon, and we'll need to provide enough space for these boats to get around them. I'm no anchoring expert, but it pretty much leaves things like, you know, screws and weight, or, you know, concrete blocks and things like that as anchors. Once again, this is open for the IPPs to propose, and yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what comes up.
Great, thanks, Simon. Listen, we're getting a lot of really good questions in from the audience. So I think in the interest of time, let's switch to the audience's questions.
Yeah.
As Simon mentioned, we actually, I mean, technically we have multiple designs for the plant already. Which one will be chosen and implemented is a different question. So some of these we won't be able to answer in terms of which technology is actually currently operating this time next year. But we'll have a lot more data on that for you.
Yeah, should I maybe go through them and list off some answers quickly, or how would you like to do this?
Yeah, I think you've had your eye on them more than I have. If you want to take a look at them, Simon.
Yeah, so the first one was about, is it designed circular with the end of use taken into account? And I can say from that one, it definitely is. It's part of the PPA that it needs to be decommissioned following the PPA period. The lagoon will be checked by E&S experts to make sure there are no lasting, well, not just damage, just lasting impacts that need to be remedied. And if there are, they'll need to be taken care of by the IPP. So that's taken into account. The second question was, does this system store electricity in batteries, or is it produced and released as it is made? It is the second one. It is just injected directly into the grid. He mentions that batteries would help with hurricanes, which might be true, but this isn't really a large hurricane area. Cynthia, correct me if I'm wrong. But when we were drafting the technical specs, we looked into that, and there's not a lot of, or any hurricanes this far north. So that wasn't a consideration that needed to be made by the IPPs. How we manage the situation with huge waves. As I mentioned, this is a halfway sort of compromise project. There are no huge waves in this tiny lagoon. It's very protected. And so the waves are small. And so most of the different solutions that are out there can be built here if they can handle the corrosion issue. When it comes to projects with, or locations with large waves, that cuts down the solutions that you can choose from significantly. There's probably only a handful that are designed for wave heights of larger than 1.5 meters or so. I think they go up to like 4 meters or something like that. But once again, that's getting to a very specific challenge, and it would just need to be handled directly with some of these manufacturers that think they can survive these rough locations. But that is tough. So you need better solutions. You need some way to break the waves for you. Is there a risk that large-scale projects, by blocking light from the surface, would damage the marine ecosystem? Yeah, and I've noticed there's quite a few E&S related questions. And now, unfortunately, I'm not an E&S expert. And maybe Cynthia can also elaborate on this, but there was an E&S study done for this project, which identified no marine life at the bottom of the lagoon. And in general, being that it is a man-made lagoon, the challenges from an E&S perspective are not as high as they would be were at another sort of near-shore marine ecosystem. And for sure, that's an area of FPV that is, still under development, and there's no consensus. There's a lot of talk in the literature. Our E&S team here at Multiconsult have been at the forefront of that, and they're participating in these debates. But essentially, you just sort of need to look at what life there is there, see what impact the floating system has, and different floating systems have different impacts, so you need to take that into account. And then E&S people have their structures for identifying and mitigating, or just cancelling any of these large risks. But once again, I'm sorry, I'm not an E&S expert, so I don't have any good answers for that. Anything you guys want to add on the E&S front?
Thank you, Simon. I'm not an EIA expert either, but we have conducted an environmental and social impact study on the site. Being a man-made lagoon, there is very few marine aquatic animals that come there, and due to the high tide and low tide variations, there is not much that is being affected in the lagoon itself. But the region of the lagoon is is prone for some birds and biodiversity that is around the area that we have proposed. Yes, it has been taken into consideration as well. And we are working on addressing international standards of the quality of the environmental and social impact assessment to make sure that our impact minimizes the risk of affecting any biodiversity that is in that region. But definitely, when we go to open waters, there is more impact that we have to check on having solar PV system floating on the ocean. But we are also working very closely with the Marine Spatial Planning Department, where they are indicating what type of human activities is allowed in what type of region of the ocean also. So for this lagoon project, the impact is very, very minimal. And when we upscale our project or go to the open ocean, we have to do a very intense impact assessment and address all these issues before we choose a site.
Maybe I can just add, I don't think it's going to be an answer to the question on whether blocking the sunlight is actually has an impact, but just maybe as a side information that is quite interesting, they are actually looking into using either floating solar or other type of system to cool the water when where you have a lot of coral, because the coral is dying mostly because of the temperature rising. So floating solar could actually be potentially a solution to this, because it captures a lot of the sunlight and the heat.
Great.
I'm seeing a question about bird soiling, Simon. What's the strategy for mitigating the effects of that? I know we don't actually know which solution is going to be chosen by the selected bidder, but maybe you could speak a little more to that.
Typically, you see things like lasers and systems that generate noise that try to scare off the birds, which work to varying levels of efficiency. I've heard people trying to generate drone based solutions that, you know, fly on, I don't know, if it was like if it was seen via camera that there are birds there, a drone could automatically be piloted to fly around and scare them off. There's no, you know, catch-all solution yet that's been proven to work. It's still another one of these technologies that's up in the air. But I would say the laser is probably the one that I see most prevalently.
We also have a question about standardization in the FPV industry. So globally, you know, are there working groups that are coming up with standards, and who's leading that effort? Do you have much information on standardization, Simon?
I think the IAC is still working on standards for this. When it comes to anchoring and mooring, there are standards for offshore applications in general, but not much specifically for the floating solar industry. I would be surprised if people aren't working on it, but I don't have any names to mention at the moment. It's a big problem in general that they're trying to standardize floating solar, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it come out in the next couple of years.
And then we also have one question on evidence about yield increases due to the cooling effect of water on the PV modules. And person's noting that there's some conflicting information about this in the market or circulating around. And can you shed any light on that, Simon? Yeah, you got to be careful what you read, because I know a lot of the manufacturers have their own estimates, which seem pretty hefty. I'm not 100% sure on what they would be either, but I would say that Ceres probably has the best data. They have their floating solar testbed in Singapore, and they've got a whole bunch of systems connected up. They're constantly measuring their output, their temperatures, all of the relevant metrics, along with a ground-based system nearby, and they're comparing it, they're running research, and they're publishing reports as they come up with them.
I would say that's probably the most reputable source that's out there at the moment. But it seems almost certain that there is some benefit.
Yeah, I've had a lot of good questions here. Am I missing any here? I think we've addressed most of these, and maybe we don't have the best, the most clear answers in terms of the technical solution that will be implemented. But again, it's only a matter of months, really. If someone sees one that I've missed, please flag it. But I think, oh, okay, one more, sorry. Cynthia, I think this one's for you. This person is asking, will the floating PV system provide more power and more consistent power to the grid than the 9 wind turbines in Victoria, or would it need to be scaled up?
Basically, by the capacity, the wind turbine in Victoria is much bigger capacity with 6 megawatt. There are 8 wind turbines. But I would say, no matter what will be the power that is generated, our RFP have capped it to have only 4 megawatt maximum to be reached, AC to be reached to the grid. So sometimes it could be higher than the wind turbines, sometimes it could be lower, but the maximum that we can get from our plant is 4 megawatt. I would say if this project is very successful and we are very happy with everything that happens with it, we go and upscale it. And that will be the time where we will be talking about comparing it with other sources. But right now, this will be this. There will not be any change on this. And depending on the wind velocity and the seasonal changes, the wind turbines power output varies intermittently also.
Great. Thanks, Cynthia. Great. Well,
I would probably add to that also solar isn't known for its reliability of output. I mean, on cloudy days, it will be going up and down a little bit. And if the wind is doing the same, it'll present some challenges. But, these will be challenges that PUC will be handling, and they've got, their spinning reserve and their alternate generators, and they have the ability to handle these things. And that'll be another interesting one to see how they go about doing it. But it's a very important challenge for all small island developing states and all little islands that are largely reliant on fossil fuels. How to work solar or renewables in general into their grid without causing additional grid stability is not easy once you get to a certain point. And there'll be a lot of good lessons learned here, which they can then use to boost their renewable penetration even further.
great. Okay, there's a lot of great questions. So thanks to everyone in the audience who's participating. I think there's a lot left to be discovered in this field, and over the next 6 months, I think we'll have some more data from this project that we can share with the market. So any last comments from the panelists of thoughts that you want to leave our audience members with? You can just wave if so. Okay. All right, I think go ahead, Cynthia.
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, I'm glad to see lots of participation and lots of questioning also, which makes us to think more about the project. And I think this is an innovative approach addressing our electricity energy needs, as well as our lack of space as an island. And once this becomes a successful project, we know we are surrounded by water. So it is up to us to work on different ways to enhance it and make it available for everyone, and address our issues that we are encountering globally. And moreover, this project have got a lot of attention. So we are working very closely and with lots of experts around us to make it a success one. So we are going for it, and we want to keep the attention towards us so that we can address all the issues in the future and keep it innovative and go into the market. Thank you.
I don't know if we have the time. I think there was a question about the Japan typhoon that has created some fire. I don't know if you've heard of it, Simon. I'm not qualified to answer the question at all.
It may have come across my desk at one point. Look, I mean, I'm not really in a position to comment on what happened. I think information is still coming in. As I understood, the plant was designed correctly according to the building codes of Japan, but still wasn't able to handle this typhoon. And I'm not exactly sure what was to blame, but what I would recommend, the lesson learned is to really not underestimate the importance of this anchoring and mooring design. Yeah, just make sure you know it's properly done. You want to make sure that the energy that's being put on the anchoring system is dispersed properly along the points where the anchoring connects to the floating plant. And it's very complicated. I myself don't have much experience with that, but we've got a whole team dedicated to anchoring and mooring for fish farming and offshore applications up there. And I just get my mind blown anytime I try to ask what I think is a simple question, and it turns out it all just depends. It's very tough. So just make sure it's done by people that are very good at this.
We're gonna have to have a whole separate panel just on anchoring and mooring.
Yeah, that wouldn't be a bad idea. I think that'd get a lot of attention.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you to the whole audience and to all of our panelists for your time and insights today. I think this has been a really good discussion. And also thank you to the Island Innovation Team for organizing this summit. I think it's a great idea. You know, islands have a lot of leadership and insight to share, but the geographic dispersion means that these virtual conferences really work for everyone. And I've just been so pleased to see that participation today. And thank you also to the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, who's the main partner for this summit. I'm personally excited to see a few more panels before the summit ends, and I hope you all do too. But just a reminder that all the panels are available as recordings after the fact. So if you have colleagues or friends who you think would benefit from today's panel and they couldn't make it, still an opportunity for them to watch. Yeah, also take a look at the ones you might have missed earlier in the week. But thank you, everyone. It's a great discussion, and I hope you have a good weekend.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.